The flames were already licking up the barn walls when Donovan realized the door had jammed shut behind her, trapping her in what would become her funeral pyre if she did not find a way out within minutes. She had come to tend to the injured mare, the one with the infected hoof that needed wrapping before nightfall, never imagining that someone would set fire to the structure with her inside. The year was 1882, and Jordan Valley, Oregon had seen its share of violence between rival ranchers, but this felt personal, vindictive, and utterly terrifying as smoke began to fill her lungs. Georgia pressed her face against the crack in the wall, trying to draw in fresh air while her mind raced through possibilities. The mare whinnied in panic behind her, kicking at her stall, and Georgia knew she had perhaps 2 minutes before the smoke overcame her completely. She had already tried the main door 3 times, throwing her full weight against it, but something heavy had been placed against it from the outside. Whoever did this wanted her dead, wanted the Donovan ranch to fall, wanted her father to suffer the loss of his only daughter. Through the gap in the boards, she could see figures running toward the barn, could hear shouting, but the roar of the flames grew louder with each passing second. Her eyes burned and watered, her throat felt raw, and her legs began to weaken as the smoke thickened into an impenetrable cloud. She sank to her knees, still trying to breathe through the small opening, when she heard a voice cut through the chaos outside. "Someone is in there. I saw her go in before the fire started." The voice belonged to Kyle Kensington, the new ranch hand her father had hired 3 weeks ago. He was a tall man with sun-darkened skin and piercing blue eyes that seemed to notice everything. A drifter who had appeared in Jordan Valley with nothing but a horse, a saddle, and a reputation for being handy with both rope and rifle. Georgia had barely spoken 10 words to him since his arrival, maintaining the proper distance a ranch owner's daughter should keep from the hired help. But she had noticed the way he worked, the gentle manner he had with the horses, and the quiet competence he brought to every task. "The door is blocked," another voice shouted. "We cannot get it open." Georgia heard the sound of men straining, heard wood scraping, but the door remained stubbornly closed. Her vision began to blur, spots dancing before her eyes as the smoke continued its assault on her body. She thought of her mother, dead these past 5 years, and wondered if she would see her again soon. She thought of her father, how this would destroy him after already losing his wife. She thought of all the things she had wanted to do, wanted to see, wanted to feel. Then the wall beside her exploded inward. Kyle Kensington came through the burning boards like an avenging angel, his shirt wrapped around his nose and mouth, his eyes streaming from the smoke but focused entirely on her. He had kicked through the weakened wall rather than waste time with the blocked door, and now he was beside her, lifting her into his arms as though she weighed nothing at all. "Hold on to me," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Close your eyes and do not let go." Georgia wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing her face against his chest as he turned back toward the hole he had created. The heat was unbearable, the smoke so thick that she could not imagine how he could see where he was going, but he moved with purpose, protecting her body with his own as burning debris fell around them. She felt him stumble once, felt his grip tighten on her, and then they were through the opening and he was running, carrying her away from the inferno that had nearly claimed her life. He did not stop until they were 50 yards from the barn, until they were safely away from the flames and collapsing structure. Only then did he set her down gently on the ground, kneeling beside her as she coughed and gasped, her lungs desperately trying to expel the smoke and draw in clean air. His hands were on her face, tilting her head up, checking her eyes, running over her arms and legs to assess for injuries. "Can you breathe?" he asked urgently. "Georgia, can you hear me?" She nodded, unable to speak yet, still coughing violently. He supported her, one arm around her shoulders, his other hand rubbing her back as her father came running across the yard, his face pale with terror. "Georgia. Sweet God, Georgia." Thomas Donovan fell to his knees beside his daughter, pulling her into a fierce embrace that made her ribs protest. She hugged him back, tears streaming down her soot-stained face, aware that she had come within moments of never seeing him again. When she finally pulled back, she looked past her father to where Kyle still knelt, his face blackened with smoke, his shirt scorched and torn, his hands bleeding from where he had torn through the burning boards. "He saved me," she said, her voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. The door was blocked. He came through the wall. Thomas Donovan turned to look at the young ranch hand, and Georgia saw something shift in her father's expression, saw recognition and gratitude and something deeper. He reached out and gripped Kyle's shoulder hard. "You have my eternal gratitude," Thomas said, his own voice thick with emotion. "Whatever you want, whatever you need, it is yours." Kyle shook his head slowly. "I just want to know who did this. That door did not block itself, and fires do not start on their own in empty barns." The words hung in the air as the barn collapsed behind them with a groan of tortured timber and a shower of sparks that lit up the darkening sky. Georgia shivered despite the heat radiating from the fire, understanding the implication. Someone had tried to murder her, and they had nearly succeeded. The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity and investigation. The local law, such as it was in Jordan Valley, consisted of an aging marshal named Porter who spent more time drinking than investigating, but even he could not ignore the evidence. The door had been barred from the outside with a heavy timber wedged under the handle. The fire had started in 3 separate locations, suggesting the use of accelerant. Someone had wanted that barn to burn fast and hot, and they had wanted Georgia trapped inside when it did. Georgia spent most of those days in her room, recovering from the smoke inhalation and the shock of nearly dying. The doctor had examined her and declared her lungs would heal, but she needed rest and clean air. Her father barely left her side except to deal with the investigation and the cleanup of the destroyed barn. And during those hours when Thomas was occupied, Georgia found herself thinking constantly about Kyle Kensington. She had watched him from her window as he worked, had seen the careful way he moved despite his own injuries, the bandages on his hands that must have pained him with every task. He had asked for nothing, had accepted no special treatment for saving her life, had simply returned to his duties as though running through burning walls was part of the job description. It fascinated her and frustrated her in equal measure. On the 4th day after the fire, Georgia finally felt strong enough to leave her room and venture outside. The late September air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sage and pine from the surrounding hills. Jordan Valley sat in a pocket of high desert country, surrounded by mountains that turned gold and purple in the changing light. It was beautiful and harsh in equal measure, a land that demanded strength from those who chose to make their lives there. She found Kyle in the far corral, working with a young stallion that her father had purchased the previous month. The horse was spirited and nervous, unused to human handling, but Kyle moved around him with patient confidence, speaking in low tones that seemed to calm the animal. Georgia leaned against the fence rail and watched, content for the moment to simply observe. It took him several minutes to notice her, and when he did, surprise flickered across his features before he nodded in greeting. He said something else to the horse, then walked over to where she stood, removing his hat as he approached. "Miss Donovan," he said formally, "you should not be out of bed yet. The doctor said you needed rest." "I have been resting for 4 days," Georgia replied, hearing the rasp still present in her voice. "I was going mad staring at the ceiling. Besides, I wanted to thank you properly. I have not had the chance." Kyle looked uncomfortable, his hat turning in his hands. "No thanks are necessary." "Any man would have done the same." "But any man did not do the same," Georgia said quietly. "You did. You risked your life for mine, and I will not forget that. Ever." Something passed between them in that moment, something Georgia could not quite name but felt all the way to her bones. Kyle's blue eyes held hers, and she saw past the careful distance he maintained, saw warmth and concern and something that made her pulse quicken. "I am glad you are all right," he said finally, and the simple words carried more weight than any poetry. They stood in silence for a moment, the air between them charged with unspoken thoughts, until the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Marshal Porter rode into the yard accompanied by her father and 2 other men Georgia recognized as neighboring ranchers. Their expressions were grim, and she felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. Thomas dismounted and walked over to where Georgia and Kyle stood. His face looked older than it had a week ago, carved with new lines of worry and anger. "They found evidence," Thomas said without preamble. "The fire was set by someone working for Marcus Sullivan. One of his hands got drunk in town last night and started bragging about teaching the Donovans a lesson. Porter arrested him this morning." Georgia felt cold despite the afternoon sun. Marcus Sullivan owned the ranch to the north, and he had been feuding with her father for the past year over water rights and grazing land. The dispute had grown increasingly bitter, but she had never imagined it would escalate to attempted murder. "What happens now?" she asked. "Sullivan claims he knew nothing about it, says the hand acted alone," Marshal Porter said, riding closer. "But we are bringing him in for questioning. This is attempted murder and someone will answer for it." The legal proceedings took nearly 2 months, and during that time, Georgia found herself spending more and more time in Kyle's company. It started innocently enough, with her seeking him out to discuss the horses or the ranch work, but gradually their conversations deepened, became more personal. She learned that he was 26 years old, 3 years older than herself, and that he had been drifting for the past 5 years after his family's ranch in Montana had failed during a drought. He spoke of loss and resilience, of learning to build a new life from the ashes of the old, and Georgia felt a kinship with him that went beyond gratitude. Kyle, for his part, seemed drawn to her despite his obvious attempts to maintain proper boundaries. He would catch himself smiling at something she said, then sober quickly, as though reminding himself of the gulf between a ranch owner's daughter and a hired hand. But Georgia saw through his careful reserve, saw the way his eyes followed her when he thought she was not looking, saw the way his expression softened when she appeared. The trial concluded in late November with Marcus Sullivan found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. His ranch hand received a prison sentence of 15 years, while Sullivan himself was fined heavily and lost the water rights he had been fighting for. Justice, such as it was on the frontier, had been served, but the experience had changed Georgia. She had looked death in the face and survived, and it had given her a clarity about what she wanted from life. What she wanted, she realized with growing certainty, was Kyle Kensington. The first snow fell on Jordan Valley in early December, transforming the high desert landscape into something pristine and magical. Georgia stood on the porch of the main house, wrapped in a heavy shawl, watching as Kyle led the horses into the barn for the night. The structure had been rebuilt in the weeks following the fire, larger and stronger than before, and Georgia no longer felt fear when she looked at it. Instead, she felt gratitude that she was alive to see it stand. "You are thinking about him again," her father said, stepping out onto the porch beside her. Georgia did not bother to deny it. Thomas Donovan had always been perceptive, and the past months had only sharpened his awareness of his daughter's feelings. "Is it that obvious?" she asked. "Only to someone who knows you well," Thomas replied. He was quiet for a moment, then added, "He is a good man. Honest, hardworking, decent. I have no complaints about his character." "But," Georgia prompted, hearing the unspoken reservation. Thomas sighed. "But nothing." "I learned something when I almost lost you, Georgia. I learned that life is too short and too uncertain to waste on worrying about what other people think. If Kyle Kensington makes you happy, if he treats you well, then he has my blessing." Georgia turned to look at her father, surprised and touched. "You mean that?" "I do," Thomas said firmly. "But you should probably talk to him about how you feel. The poor man has been tying himself in knots trying to be respectful and proper. Put him out of his misery." Georgia laughed, the sound still carrying a slight rasp from her damaged lungs, then impulsively hugged her father. "Thank you," she whispered. She found Kyle in the barn, as she had known she would, checking on the horses one final time before heading to the bunkhouse for the night. He looked up as she entered, surprise crossing his face, and set down the bucket he had been carrying. "Miss Donovan, is everything all right?" "Stop calling me Miss Donovan," Georgia said, walking toward him with purpose. "You carried me out of a burning building." "I think we can dispense with the formalities." Kyle's expression was wary, uncertain. "Georgia, then, is something wrong?" "Yes," she said, stopping directly in front of him. "Something has been wrong for weeks, and I am tired of pretending otherwise. I am tired of dancing around what I feel, of maintaining proper distance, of acting like you are just another ranch hand when we both know that is not true." Kyle stared at her, and she saw a flicker of hope war with caution in his eyes. "Georgia, you should not say things like that." My father just gave us his blessing," Georgia interrupted. "So that excuse will not work. Try again." A smile tugged at the corner of Kyle's mouth, the first genuine smile she had seen from him in days. "I have nothing to offer you. No land, no money, no prospects beyond what I can earn with my hands and my back. You deserve better than a drifter with nothing to his name." "What I deserve," Georgia said softly, reaching up to touch his face, "is someone who would run through fire for me. Someone who treats me like an equal instead of a prize or a burden. Someone who makes me feel alive. I deserve you, Kyle Kensington, if you will have me." Kyle's hand came up to cover hers where it rested against his cheek, his eyes searching her face as though trying to determine if this was real. Then, very slowly, he leaned down and kissed her, and Georgia felt the world shift beneath her feet. His lips were gentle despite the obvious intensity of his feelings, reverent in a way that made her heart ache. When they finally broke apart, both breathing harder, Kyle rested his forehead against hers. "I have loved you since the day I pulled you from that fire," he admitted quietly. "Maybe even before that, but I never let myself hope that you might feel the same way." "Then you are not nearly as observant as I thought," Georgia said, smiling. "I have been hopeless at hiding my feelings. Ask anyone." Kyle laughed, the sound rich and warm, and pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her. They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the quiet barn while snow continued to fall outside, and Georgia felt a peace settle over her that she had not known she was missing. The courtship that followed was the talk of Jordan Valley for months. Some approved, admiring the romance of the ranch hand who had proven his worth by saving the owner's daughter. Others gossiped about Georgia Donovan lowering herself, about Thomas being too permissive, about the impropriety of it all. Georgia ignored them all, secure in her choice and in Kyle's devotion. They were married in the spring of 1883. in a simple ceremony held at the ranch, with the entire valley invited to attend. Georgia wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her taller frame, and carried wildflowers picked from the meadows beyond the house. Kyle wore a new suit that Thomas had insisted on buying him, looking uncomfortable in the formal attire but radiantly happy. When Marshal Porter, acting as justice of the peace, pronounced them husband and wife, Kyle kissed her with such tenderness that several of the watching women openly wept. Thomas had a wedding gift for them beyond the celebration. He had been planning it for months, he explained, waiting for the right moment to present it. He led them to the east section of the ranch, to a spot where the land rose in gentle slopes toward the mountains, where a creek ran year-round and cottonwood trees provided shade. "This section is yours," Thomas announced. 200 acres to build your own place, to run your own cattle. You will still work the main ranch with me, Kyle, but you will do it as a partner, not a hired hand. This land will be your foundation, and someday, when I am gone, the entire Donovan ranch will pass to Georgia and therefore to you both." Kyle looked stunned, unable to speak for a moment. When he finally found his voice, it was thick with emotion. "Sir, I do not know what to say. This is too generous." "It is what you have earned," Thomas said firmly. "You saved my daughter's life, and you have proven yourself a dozen times over in the months since. You are family now, Kyle. This is what family does." They built their house that summer, a modest but sturdy structure with a wide porch that faced the mountains, and a stone fireplace that Kyle constructed with his own hands. The entire valley seemed to turn out to help with the raising, neighbors setting aside old feuds and petty disputes to celebrate new beginnings. By autumn, the house was complete, and Georgia and Kyle moved in with a few pieces of furniture, some wedding gifts, and boundless optimism. Their first winter in the new house was harsh, with snow piling deep and temperatures dropping below zero for weeks at a time. But Georgia had never been happier. She woke each morning beside the man she loved, worked alongside him during the day, and fell asleep in his arms each night. They talked about everything and nothing, made plans for the future, learned each other's habits and quirks. Kyle was patient and kind, quick to laugh and slow to anger, and he treated Georgia with a respect that never diminished into taking her for granted. He asked her opinion on ranch matters, listened when she had ideas, and never dismissed her thoughts as those of a mere woman. In turn, Georgia worked to make their house a home, to build a life that satisfied them both. In the spring of 1884, Georgia discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and terror in equal measure, the awareness that they would soon be responsible for a tiny life that depended entirely on them. Kyle became even more attentive than usual, worried about Georgia's health, insisting she rest more and work less. Georgia tolerated his fussing with good humor, knowing it came from love. Their son was born in November of that year, during the first snowstorm of the season. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Kyle feared he would lose Georgia, feared that the miracle of their love would end in tragedy. But Georgia was strong, strengthened by survival and determination, and when the baby finally emerged with a lusty cry, Kyle wept with relief. They named him Thomas, after Georgia's father, but called him Tommy to avoid confusion. He was a healthy, red-faced baby with his mother's dark hair and his father's blue eyes, and he captured their hearts completely. Thomas Donovan was equally smitten with his first grandchild, spending hours at their house just holding the baby and telling him stories. The years that followed were good ones for the Kensington family. The ranch prospered despite the usual challenges of weather and market fluctuations. Kyle proved to have an exceptional eye for cattle, knowing which stock to keep and which to sell, when to move the herds and when to let them rest. Under his management, working in partnership with Thomas, the Donovan Ranch became one of the most successful operations in eastern Oregon. Tommy grew into a curious, active child who seemed to fear nothing, much to his parents' alternating pride and terror. He learned to ride before he could properly walk, following his father around the ranch on a gentle old mare that Kyle had specifically trained for the purpose. Georgia often stood on the porch and watched them, her heart full, thinking about the day Kyle had carried her from the fire and set all of this in motion. In 1887, Georgia gave birth to a daughter they named Catherine, called Katie, who had her father's quiet confidence and her mother's stubborn determination. 2 years later, another son arrived named William, called Billy, who proved to be the most rambunctious of the three. Their house rang with laughter and the chaos of children, and Georgia sometimes had to remind herself that this was her life, that this happiness was real and lasting. Thomas Donovan lived long enough to see all 3 of his grandchildren, to teach Tommy the business of ranching, to bounce Katie on his knee, and to hold Billy as an infant. He passed quietly in his sleep in the winter of 1890, and the entire valley turned out for his funeral. He was buried next to Georgia's mother on a hill overlooking the ranch, and Georgia stood at the graveside with Kyle's arm around her, and her children pressed close, grateful that her father had lived to see the family legacy secured. The responsibility of running the entire ranch fell to Kyle and Georgia then, and they rose to meet it. They hired good people, treated them fairly, and built a reputation for integrity that extended far beyond Jordan Valley. Neighboring ranchers sought Kyle's advice on breeding and range management. Georgia became known for her skill with horses, particularly the difficult ones that others had given up on, and people came from 3 counties over to have her train their animals. Through it all, through the good years and the lean ones, through the everyday joys and the occasional sorrows, Kyle and Georgia's love remained the foundation of everything they built. They still stole moments alone when they could, still talked late into the night when the children were asleep, still looked at each other across a crowded room and felt that same spark that had ignited in a snow-covered barn. As their children grew, Georgia made sure they knew the story of how their parents had met, how their father had run through fire to save their mother's life. Tommy, pragmatic and serious even as a young boy, asked detailed questions about the construction of the barn and how Kyle had known where to kick through. Katie, imaginative and romantic, sighed over the dramatic rescue and declared she would marry someone brave too. Billy just wanted to know if there were any horses in the barn when it burned, and was relieved to learn the mare had been rescued as well. The years turned, as years do, and the 19th century gave way to the 20th. Jordan Valley changed around them, growing from a rough frontier town into an established community with a school, a proper church, and regular rail service to the larger cities. The Wild West was slowly being tamed, but the land itself remained as beautiful and demanding as ever. Kyle and Georgia aged together, their faces gaining lines and their hair turning gray, but their love never diminished. If anything, it deepened with time, enriched by shared experiences and weathered storms. They watched their children grow into capable adults, watched Tommy take over more of the ranch management, watched Katie marry a schoolteacher from Boys, watched Billy head off to study veterinary medicine. On a cool evening in September of 1905, Georgia and Kyle sat together on the porch of the house they had built 22 years earlier. Their grandchildren played in the yard, Tommy's children and Katie's first baby, and the sound of their laughter drifted on the breeze. Georgia leaned against Kyle's shoulder, his arm around her waist, and thought about how far they had come. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked quietly. "The fire." "Every time I look at you," Kyle replied honestly. "I think about how close I came to never having this life, never knowing this happiness. It terrifies me, even now." Georgia turned to look at him, seeing the man she loved in every weathered line of his face. "I think about it too. Not with fear, though, with gratitude. Everything we have, everything we built together, it all started in that moment when you came through the wall and refused to let me die." Kyle smiled and kissed her forehead. "I would do it again in a heartbeat. Run through 100 fires if that is what it took to keep you safe." "I know you would," Georgia said softly. "You have proven it 1,000 times in 1,000 small ways. That is what love is, I think. Not just the grand gestures, but the daily choice to be there, to stay, to build something together that neither of us could build alone." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold. The children's laughter continued, the horses whinnied in the distance, and the creek burbled over stones worn smooth by time. It was an ordinary evening, unremarkable in every way except for the profound contentment it represented. Tommy came out of the barn and waved to them, heading toward his own house where his wife would have dinner waiting. Katie's husband called to their children, rounding them up for the journey back to town. Billy was due home from college in another month, full of new knowledge and eager to start his veterinary practice. The family they had created continued to grow and branch, new generations carrying forward the legacy of love and hard work. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Kyle stood and offered Georgia his hand. She took it, letting him pull her to her feet, and they walked into their house together. The same house where they had raised their children, celebrated countless birthdays and holidays, comforted each other through losses, and built a life of meaning and purpose. Inside, Kyle built up the fire while Georgia prepared a simple supper. They had fallen into comfortable rhythms over the years, anticipating each other's needs and movements. After they ate, they sat by the fire, Kyle in his chair reading the newspaper while Georgia worked on mending. It was peaceful and domestic, the kind of evening they had shared thousands of times before. "I love you," Georgia said suddenly, looking up from her sewing. "I know I tell you often, but I want to make sure you truly know it. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Kyle Kensington." Kyle set down his newspaper and met her eyes, his expression soft with affection. "I love you too, Georgia. You made me believe I could be more than a drifter, more than someone who had lost everything. You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. You gave me everything." They smiled at each other across the firelight, two people who had found each other against the odds and built something beautiful from the ashes of near tragedy. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of rain. The mountains stood eternal in the distance, and the land they had worked and loved spread around them in all directions. Georgia returned to her mending, and Kyle picked up his newspaper again. But both were acutely aware of the gift of the moment, of the blessing of growing old together, of the miracle that had begun in fire and smoke, and had blossomed into something that would outlast them both. Years continued to pass as they always do, bringing new joys and new challenges. The ranch adapted to changing times, incorporating new techniques while honoring old traditions. Kyle proved to be not just a capable rancher but a wise mentor, teaching a new generation the skills and values that had built the Donovan ranch. Georgia remained active and engaged, her mind sharp and her opinions valued by family and community alike. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in 1923, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who had come from across the state to honor them. The party was held at the main ranch house, the one where Georgia had grown up, and as Kyle stood to offer a toast to his wife, his voice was still strong despite his 70 years. 40 years ago, I married the bravest, strongest, most beautiful woman I had ever met, he said, raising his glass. Every day since has been an adventure. Every day has reaffirmed that running into that burning barn was the easiest decision I ever made, because it led to this. To all of you. To this family, this legacy, this love that has sustained me through everything. Georgia, my darling wife, you are still the fire that warms my heart and the light that guides my way. Here is to 40 more years. Everyone laughed at the optimistic toast, knowing that 40 more years was unlikely at their age, but they appreciated the sentiment. Georgia stood and went to her husband, kissing him soundly to the applause and good-natured cheers of their assembled family. "You are still the most romantic man I know," she said when they broke apart, "and I love you more than words can express." The years that followed were quieter, gentler. As Kyle and Georgia gradually stepped back from the daily operations of the ranch and let their children and grandchildren take the lead. They spent their days in the house they had built, the one that held so many memories, content to watch the sunset and tend their garden and enjoy the peace they had earned. Kyle's health began to fail in the winter of 1926. It started with a persistent cough that would not go away, then progressed to weakness and shortness of breath. The doctors and boys could do little except make him comfortable and prepare the family for the inevitable. Kyle faced his mortality with the same quiet courage he had faced everything else, more concerned about how Georgia would manage without him than about his own fate. "You have to promise me something," he said one evening as they sat together by the fire. He was wrapped in blankets, his breathing labored, but his eyes were clear and focused on his wife. "Anything," Georgia said, holding his hand tightly. "Promise me you will keep living," Kyle said. "Not just existing, but truly living. Enjoy the grandchildren, travel if you want to. Do not shut yourself away in grief. I need to know that you will be all right." Georgia felt tears slip down her cheeks, but she nodded. "I promise. But only because I know that what we built together will continue. You are part of everything here, Kyle. Part of this land, this family, this legacy. You will never truly be gone," Kyle smiled, reaching up to wipe away her tears. "When I think about my life, I have no regrets. None. Every good thing I have ever known came from you, came from the life we built together. I am the luckiest man who ever lived." He passed quietly 3 days later, with Georgia beside him and their family gathered close. He simply closed his eyes and stopped breathing, slipping away as gently as snow falling. Georgia held his hand for a long time after he was gone, unwilling to break that final connection, until Tommy gently urged her to let go. They buried Kyle on the hill next to Thomas Donovan and his wife, with a simple marker that read, "Kyle Kensington, beloved husband, father, and grandfather. He ran through fire for love and built a life of purpose." 1857–1927. Georgia grieved, as anyone would after losing their partner of more than 40 years, but she kept her promise to Kyle. She continued to live fully, investing herself in her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, sharing stories of the early days, passing on the wisdom she and Kyle had gained. She remained in the house they had built, surrounded by memories but not imprisoned by them. On warm summer evenings, she would sit on the porch and remember the day she had nearly died in a burning barn. Remember the moment Kyle had come through the wall like salvation itself. Remember their first kiss in that rebuilt barn, their wedding day, the birth of their children, the 1,000 small moments that had made up their life together. She remembered it all with gratitude and love, knowing that what they had shared was rare and precious. Georgia lived to the remarkable age of 91, remaining sharp and engaged until the very end. She passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1943, and her family buried her next to Kyle, reuniting them at last. Her marker was equally simple. Georgia Donovan Kensington, beloved wife, mother, and matriarch. She survived the fire and lived with grace. 1857–1943. The ranch they had built together continued to thrive, passed down through generations who honored the legacy of hard work, integrity, and love that Kyle and Georgia had established. The story of how they met, of the cowboy who ran through fire to save the woman who would become his wife, became family legend, told and retold to each new generation as a reminder of what love could inspire people to do. The house they built stood for more than a century, eventually preserved as a historical landmark. Visitors came to see where the famous rescue had happened, where a drifter and a ranch owner's daughter had defied convention to build something extraordinary. They walked through the rooms where Kyle and Georgia had raised their family, stood on the porch where they had watched countless sunsets, and felt the echo of a love that had been strong enough to overcome fire, prejudice, hardship, and time itself. In the end, what had started with smoke and flames and desperate courage had become something beautiful and lasting. Kyle Kensington had run through fire to save Georgia Donovan's life, but in truth, they had saved each other. They had found in each other a partner, a purpose, and a love that had sustained them through everything life could throw at them. They had built a family, a legacy, and a story that would be remembered long after they were gone. And on quiet evenings in Jordan Valley, when the wind whispers through the cottonwoods and the mountains turn purple in the fading light, some say you can still feel their presence, still sense the enduring power of a love that began in fire and lasted beyond a lifetime. It is a reminder that true love is not just about the grand romantic gestures, though those certainly have their place. It is about the daily choice to be there, to stay, to build something together that honors both individuals while creating something greater than either could achieve alone. Kyle and Georgia's story was not just about a rescue or even about falling in love. It was about what came after, about the life they built together through dedication, compromise, mutual respect, and unwavering commitment. It was about surviving the fire, literally and metaphorically, and using that survival as a foundation for something meaningful. Their descendants still ranch in Jordan Valley, still tend the land that Kyle and Georgia loved, still tell their story to anyone who will listen. And every time a young person falls in love, every time someone takes a chance on an unlikely romance, every time courage leads to connection, the spirit of what Kyle and Georgia created lives on. Because in the end, love is not about perfection or convenience or meeting society's expectations. Love is about seeing someone truly, choosing them completely, and building with them daily. It is about running through fire when necessary and tending the hearth when not. It is about creating something that outlasts the individual lives that created it, something that ripples forward through time, touching and shaping everyone it reaches. That was the gift Kyle and Georgia gave to each other and to everyone who came after them, and it remained their truest and most enduring legacy.